All right, it is time to get started. Hello and welcome to TransForm Tuesday. My name is Dave McCormick. I'm VP of Products and Services here at Alpha Software. And I'm pleased to present today Nikos Kazantzis. Nikos demonstrated an application for us a couple weeks ago. It was a back office type of application written with Alpha Anywhere, in which he was able to query the TransForm database, look up records and dispatch records and do some other cool stuff as well. And while he did demonstrate that, he didn't show us yet how he did it. And today he's going to reveal his secrets. So let's get started. I'm going to take you off mute here, Nikos. Nikos, are you there?
Hey, Dave. Hello, everyone.
Hey, let me go ahead and make you the presenter. And you should see a dialog box. And there's your screen.
Okay.
Ready to go.
So, pleasure to be back. As you mentioned, Dave, today we're going to show in Alpha Anywhere how we built this component. It's a simple two-screen UX component that we'll dive into. There are a couple of updates since the last showing of this in our in the webinar 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I'll mention those changes at the end. So this component, as we mentioned, has really two basic screens. One is the form instance screen, where we see the forms that have been submitted, and an extension of that is, as you might remember, what we did to go to the edit screen and see the detailed fields and fill them in. And then the other one is the create and dispatch screen, where we have our user list, we have the form types available in the account, and we create and assign forms to users. So let's jump into Alpha Anywhere and show how that component was built. So obviously, we're going to be making some assumptions about the how a UX works, so we won't be covering the very extreme basics of how to put this together. But this is more towards the transform specific parts, what you would need and what we did here to make this work with the equipment inspection app, and what the audience would need to do if you wanted to do the same or even adapt it to a customized equipment inspection form that you may have, or even actually any type of form type that you may have. Okay, so let's start with the first screen. The first screen that we saw, so this screen, this element here is a list, what we call the list control in the UX. And it is this one here, equipment inspection. And the way we built that is we added this list to this component from the data control section. There's a control type called a list. And when we do that, we get a list of options. And the initial and primary one is our data source. And here we have a number of possible data sources. In this case, obviously, we pick TransForm. To use the list with a TransForm data source, we need an API key that we create via our TransForm account. And we give it the form ID of the form that we're using. So if we go back, for example, to our TransForm Central screen, we will see that if we go to equipment inspection, this here is our form ID. This is what we need to enter on that screen. So once we do that and we've created an API key, then the list control automatically reads back the fields that correspond to that form. So if you go to the Fields tab, you'll see that it has already been populated with all of the data coming back for that specific form type, the equipment inspection. And you can see, for example, we have the metadata fields. These are the built-in ones, the ones that come with every form. And these are the custom ones, the ones that we added to our form, to the equipment inspection form. So having our fields here, we can then decide which of these fields we want to show on screen. And we do that using the list layout and choosing our columns layout. We see here are our available fields, and here are the fields that we show. So you'll see that these now correspond to what we're seeing here in this list as column names and column headers and the data inside. Okay, so that's really all that is needed here. So just to display it, just to display all of the form instances, we just link, as we saw with the API key, enter the form ID, decide which set of fields we want to display in our list, and that's it. If we want to paginate, what's the page size? It has a navigation bar, and that's really it. That's all the configuration needed to get to a basic list like this. Now, obviously, for a few records, this is enough, and there's a page navigator to get you through if there are maybe a few dozens. But if there are more, then obviously we come into this search part here. So the search part would help us narrow down our initially longer list to a shorter data set. So to build the search capability here back in the UX, we've created a set of fields corresponding to what we want to search. There are a couple of points here that we'll jump in a little later. So we define we want to search by status, by site code, by building name, city, state, all of the fields that we need to search by. And then, having added a button here, we add, so there's, from the built-in set of actions, one of the actions as we search here is filter records in a list control. So what this does is, this does a server-side query, and because it is a transform based list, the transform data source, it knows and actually configures the API call to the transform API with the set of data predefined that we're searching by. And to be able to do that, we need to define the search field mapping. So we need to say, for each of the fields that we have on our UX, so all of the search fields that we added one by one, we say what actual field from the form this corresponds to. So this window that opened up here is actually the fields that are coming back from transform that say these are the fields contained in the form. Whereas these fields here are the fields that I've added to my component here in my UX. So I'm saying that when I type something in the search site code field, I want the API call to go back and do a server-side search on the site code field in my form, okay, and so on. And as I'm going through all of these, the combined search of more than one of these parameters I've defined to be an AND combination, could be an OR, okay. Now, one important distinction here is that every field from here to here is just a single field to search by. But this one, it's a date created from, but obviously when we're searching date created, we actually have two fields. So we have date created from and date created to. So we need to search one field with a range from to. So what this builder gives us in this case is to say it is a range search. And if it is a range search on the metadata field called created date, then we need to also tell it what is the end of the range. So this field is considered to be the start of the range from, and we also need to tell it what is the field that ends the range to. So then it properly configures the API call to the server-side search to actually do a date range search for this field. Okay, and that is it. And that is now what allows us to add search this component. So again, no code needed, no manually written code needed. This takes care of the API configuration call by itself. Okay, so on this level, this screen was built like we just showed. Now, to get to the edit functionality, which says that I'm actually getting into the form instance and retrieving more data from it, and possibly filling it in as we had seen with other info, we need to add what we call a detail view. And again, if you're not familiar with detail view, it's a standard basic concept of a UX of a list control in a UX. So what we do is we define another set of fields on the form, which are similar to the ones we had for search, but this time they are the actual fields that display the data for each form instance. And they don't only display it, but it allows us also to edit that field and update it with a new value. So when we are creating any number of fields that we want, we don't need to include all of the form fields on our component. We may only need one or need to edit some of them. And in that case, we add as many as we need. And then we need to do the mapping. So we go back to our list, and we go to we first of all we go to list properties and say this list has a detail view, and then this tab opens up where we have a detail view map. And when we go to the detail view map, now you'll see a wizard opens up that says this is the list control column. So this is the field coming back from the form, and this is the control, the text field on our UX that holds that value. So that's how I do this mapping, to say that whenever you're reading zip code and country from the form instance, go to the field called zip and the field called country on the UX and put that value in there. So down here, for example. Okay, so that's how this is filled in. And then obviously when we do an update, when we make an update, we have save and reset buttons and also delete buttons. These are the standard buttons that come here from defined controls. There's a section for list detail view buttons, and these allow us to add, save, reset, or delete. So the code is pretty standard here, what needs to be done for saving the updates back to the list. And then when we are on the list page, so here, then you remember when we make an edit, the synchronize button is enabled. And again, this is standard template code that comes with the list control defined buttons option. And this is what it does. And this is the enable expression that makes it gray when there's no update to the list, or makes it active when something has been changed. Okay, now again, everything that needs to happen at this point is done in the background for us. We don't need to write any code to get the list updates that we did. So if we updated here to say the site code is BOS 001 and the site building is high-rise 5 or whatever else, this data needs to be saved back to the TransForm backend, the TransForm database, and that is done via an API call. But since it's configured via a list and detail view combo, you don't need to write that API call yourself. The synchronize method of the list already knows that because it's a TransForm data source, it already knows that it needs to launch that API and configure it properly. So again, there's nothing for you to need it to be done manually at this point. Okay, so we've got our form instance, we've populated. There's one small detail here that we may add now. This is pretty standard, which says that when we're editing something, here I've created a lookup. So where does this data come from? How does it know that this is our list? Remember when we had our form, our mobile form, we were using Google Sheets, for example, or we had an on-device database option. Obviously here, this is a browser app, so on-device database isn't applicable in this case. So what I did is I just created a very small helper database, a MySQL database here. And all I did was I went to this field and I said this field is a lookup field. And it is of an auto-suggest type. And I just go to a table called sites and I pick my site code and then I fill in the rest. Again, this is pretty standard UX type of functionality that allows you to do a lookup on a database and return results for one field, and then also fill in other fields with the relevant other data in that row from the selected field. So that's how we got to this point. So now this screen is working as we showed. But as you remember, to get to the screen for new forms, we had to go to this screen and say, this is a user, this is the form, create and assign. Now, for this part, we do need to add a little bit of code. We do need to write the API calls ourselves and use the TransForm API that's available. And the reason is that these are now data items and lists that are coming back from the backend for specific users. So this is the user table of the account. This is the form type list of the account. And we're not pointing at form instances. So that's why we're not able to create, to use a standard list like we did in the previous example. So the way we do that is, here are our two lists, our user list and our form types list. So the user list is the one here on the left, and the forms is the one here on the right, form types. And in this case, our list is not a TransForm data source because we're not getting form instances. It is a custom data source. Custom data source means that the data that will populate this list comes from an XBasic function that we define in this same component. And we call this, for the users list, we call this get users, and there's an equivalent one for form types that is called get form definitions. Okay, and the code to do that, you'll find it. Obviously, we'll be distributing this component to anyone who needs it. So you'll find here in the XBasic functions the get forms, get form definitions, and get users. So get users is just this. So again, you need an API key to be able to make this call. This is the TransForm API function that is being used. And then this is the way to call it from XBasic. And then we just get the result, get a JSON generation, a JSON object from those results, and just return that as the name of the function, which means the list data is the JSON transformation of the results that came back from here. By the way, if you haven't seen this, here in the Alpha Anywhere IDE, there is, here in the tools section, there's an API Explorer. And this has all of the methods that are available for the TransForm API with a test environment and the equivalent methods that you would need to use in your XBasic code if you need it. Okay, so you see, for example, get users in TransForm account. This is what is returned back as a JSON object, and then obviously we parse that in our function to get just the items that we need. Okay, so you can test your functions here and get the XBasic code directly that you need for that. Okay, so that was the one function that we had, the get users, and then there's an equivalent one, get form definitions. Again, almost exactly the same way, but just a different call, so a different API function used here. Okay, so that gets us this, and then there's the third function. So we have a button there at the bottom which says create and assign. There it is. So all this is doing is just making an AJAX callback. And what is the AJAX callback? It's calling a function called create form instance that we've built also manually here. So here is create form instance. This is calling this TransForm API method. And what we're essentially passing in is this object, which says, what is the form ID and what is the person? These are the two parameters that we're using. So we're just picking up the values that were submitted as the button was pressed in the two lists that we had selected. So we clicked on the users list, we clicked on the form types list to select, and then we replace the values in this template with the data that was just submitted. And then we call the API method via this XBasic method. And then we create a transit message saying if the result was successful or failed. Okay, so that's really it for the code needed. And again, this is just to be able to enable that more easy interface of just clicking and assigning instead of typing in like we have now in the management console. So this is not mandatory, but if you do want to do it, that is, let's say, the amount of code that you need. Now, there's also another item here. Actually, this is also here, but this is shown directly, but also here. So what you see here in the assigned to and what you see here in the assigned to fields is the actual display name of the user. But in reality, what is coming back from the API is not the display name here, but it is the email ID, the unique ID of the user. So the way we can make this appear to be the display name, which is obviously more user-friendly than showing any, well, we could show the email here as well, but this is a little bit more user-friendly, is to use a property of the list control called a lookup column. So if we go back to our list and we go to our list properties, we have here what we call a lookup column. And we call that usernames. And we look up the email ID that's coming back from the form as we're browsing through it. And then we do a lookup based on a client-side JavaScript function, get username from email. So that's what allows us, and the JavaScript function is here. Okay, so this is what allows us to search the email and get back the display name, and that's what we're returning. And this obviously this runs for each row in the list, and that's how we can get that data to display. And we're doing a similar type of lookup also in the other sections where we're actually showing a display name. So here we're showing a display name. Here we're showing a display name, and here we're also doing it, but this is now part of the data that's coming back, so we didn't really need to do that. Okay, so I mentioned a couple of differences for compared to what we showed last time. So one of the additions is that we've added a map component. So one of the very recent additions to the list control in a UX is the capability to switch the layout to a different form. So right now this is a columnar layout, so let's say resembling a grid of information. But because, as you may remember, for each of the forms that we are filling in, we also have coordinate data. Yeah, I've made some change somewhere. Let me just refresh this. So if we go here and we check the data, you remember we have coordinates for each site. Then there is a method of the list control that says switch to a map layout and pick up if we have coordinates for each of the records, and then show these on a map. So when we switch the layout, you'll see that these items now switch and show us the relevant icons on a map view.
Very cool.
And not only that, but we can also, via a hover selector, also define what shows on the map as we put our mouse over it. So in this case, I've decided to show the site name, so the building name, plus the display name of the assigned person. Okay, then we can switch back to our grid to get back to the stage. Now, again, to do that, this was all built. So it's a built-in option of the list, which has multiple layouts. So if we go down here to the layout section, you'll see that has multiple layouts checkbox marked, and this opens up this tab here. So I've added a second one, which is of a type map, and all I did was I configured this wizard. You can see all of the options that are available for what happens when you click on a marker, how to display the markers, what are the fields that are being picked up. So I'm just returning these data. So that's the row of data that is at that moment in the list, and this runs for all of the rows in the list at that point. So I'm just getting these two fields back, and I'm using them as lat long to define where the marker is. And then I'm also creating a marker title, which is, so I'm returning the site building name and a slash and the usernames. And remember, the usernames is the lookup value that we use to show the display name from the email ID. and that's what allows us to get to the map. And the buttons that switch between them, again, are just standard get control select current layout. So choose a map, or in the other one we say choose what we call columns. So to get back to that section. Okay, and the second difference that you'll see is that in order to keep this component as low code as possible, you might have noticed that there are a couple of date fields missing here. So we are searching, we're able to do search against date created, built in with the search method that we showed here. But if you remember in that previous component, we also had here some fields to do search on date time in and date time out. So these are not shown here at this point, and the reason is that this capability is not built into the search function because it's the server-side function that works against metadata, and this is not metadata. This is a form data field. These are fields that we added to our form. So if you wanted to do that search, you would have to write a, let's say, client-side search to filter this list, and that's what I showed in my previous, in our previous example 3 weeks ago. So because that is a little bit of a let's say, of a longer piece of code than what we've shown so far, I've taken this out for now. And the reason I've taken this out is that this is also coming very soon as a feature to be able to say, don't only do date searches against metadata, but also be able to do date range searches against form data. So because this is not working, as part of the list control no code at this point, I've just taken this out for now. When we have those, then we'll be able to do the exact same thing we did for date time in and date time out. So when we go to our search definition, here where we said search and said filter records in a list control and define the search fields that we want, here we would add those two more. So time in and date time out, and this would allow a search option. So it's not there now. If you do need it, we can, Dave, I'm sure we can share the client side maybe code template for people to be able to do that. But it's going to be there soon. That also the form data date fields will have a range search, so you'll be able to do it built in as well. So I think that's it from a very quick overview. Do we have a Q&A session, just to leave some time open for that?
Yeah, we do have one question, and it's simply, is the map view available in the current Alpha Anywhere production, or is it a pre-release feature?
It is a pre-release feature, actually, I think from last week or last couple of weeks.
I think that's right as well. Yeah. Do we have any other questions?
And just as a hint here, to make this map component work, you do need to go to your project settings in Alpha Anywhere and give it a Google Maps API key. Since 2 or 3 years back, that the Google API calls only work with a key. It's free to use for a reasonable amount of traffic, but you still need to enter that in there.
So I like the way this question is phrased. It goes, so the next question is ... Yeah, I'm sure it's going to be, so when is that production release going to come out for now? I think we're probably 3 or 4 weeks off if I had to guess, but we may be slipping something in before then. And we can get a better date for you if you need to. If you need it, just send an email to tfguides@alphasoftware.com. And that looks like it. Hey, Nikos, thanks very much. It's a very cool little system that you've built. And I'm sure that people got a lot of seeing it put together. And as the new features come in and we start being able to search on more things, it'll be fun watching that use case expand. So cool. So thank you again. Thanks everyone who showed up today. And we look forward to seeing you at next Transform Tuesday. Take care and have a great week. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.